All right, so we're going to crack into the forearm and hand lecture today. So first off, with any kinesiology lecture, we want to take a look at the bones and take a look at the joints afterwards and the muscles. So first bone we're going to look at is the humerus. Then we'll look at the bones of the forearm, including the radius and the ulna. Then we'll look at the carpal bones and then the bones of the hand. So I have already gone out and drawn a little picture. So, hopefully you'll be able to, if with a, very minor art skills, be able to draw and recreate something similar to this here. So here we have a right arm, and we're looking at the anterior view. Now, we already have discovered some of the other major landmarks of the humerus in the shoulder and arm video, so you can go and look for the rest of those in that. So let's just take a look at the distal half of the humerus, namely the landmarks here that are around our elbow. So the first few landmarks we see are these condyles. Now, these condyles are the big bumps on the sides of your elbow here, the big bumps that you can actually press into right here. Now, something I want to point out is that when I reference the medial or lateral condyle, which, medial would be on the midline or medial side of the humerus itself, and then lateral being on the opposite side. Whenever I mention these medial and lateral condyles, I want you to also imagine that there's several other landmarks associated with these, such as the epicondyle and supracondylar ridge. Now, these two additional landmarks are just landmarks that are very intimately close to these condyles. So the epicondyle is just another landmark, like literally right above the condyle itself. And then the supracondylar ridge is just a crest or a raised edge above the condyle itself. And this will come into play later on when we're trying to just simplify some of the landmarks and attachment sites we're looking at in the origins and insertions of the muscles. So medial and lateral condyles in this particular image, which includes the medial epicondyle and medial supracondylar ridge, and the same for the lateral side. They have the same landmarks to themselves. Then we have a couple landmarks in between those two condyles. One, we have the trochlea, which is the more medial landmark, and then we have the capitulum, which is the more lateral landmark. Now, these two landmarks are a little bit important because they're going to be forming joints in our lecture today. So then we look into our forearm. Our forearm here consists of two bones. We have the ulna and the radius. Our ulna is the medial bone of the forearm, while our radius is the lateral bone. So looking at the ulna, there's a few more landmarks to the than the radius. So a couple things is, one, I've drawn it like this to make it kind of look like a wrench, because the ulna at the side of, or the proximal side closest to the elbow, has kind of like this hook-like shape, almost like a wrench. And so I try to draw it like a wrench because this whole totality here is called the olecranon process. The olecranon process is that bump you'd feel right here, commonly known as the elbow. And so with this wrench, we have this little depression right here, this little groove called the trochlear notch, which, well, I just looked at. So there's a little bump here called the coronoid process on the front of the little hook here, the little notch here on the upside of the little lip of the wrench of the ulna itself. And then, of course, we have the shaft, and then the head is at the distal end of the ulna. Looking at the radius, only a few landmarks to really pay attention to. One, the head of the radius is the more proximal landmark. And over here, it will articulate with the capitulum, as we'll see here, as we find it to be part of one of our joints. Of course, we have the shaft of the radius. We have the carpal end of the radius, which is the part that's going to articulate with the wrist bones, carpal bones, and then the styloid process of the radius itself. Then we have the carpal bones. There are 8 carpal bones, and they're lined up in 2 rows. We have a proximal row and we have a distal row. So we have 4 bones in the proximal row and 4 bones in the distal row. And we'll label those in a second here. Let's just crack into something a little bit easier, which are the bones of the hands and the fingers. So of the palm of your hand, you have bones that are here in the palm or web of the hand, I guess you could say. We call these the metacarpals, which means they're an extension of or extending from the carpal bones. So we have 5 of those bones, and we number our digits 1 through 5, starting with the thumb being number 1. And this is going to be the same for the foot, with our big toe being number 1. The biggest digit is the leading number. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Then we get into the bones of the fingers, which we call phalangeal bones because our fingers are known as phalanges. Now, when it comes to our phalanges, in all of the fingers except for the thumb, and all the digits except for the thumb, there are 3 phalangeal bones. As you can see in this depiction here, our pinky, our ring finger, our middle finger, our index finger, all have 3 bones, all 3 phalangeal bones. And then our thumb only has 2. So in this particular case, the thumb only has a proximal and a distal phalangeal bone. Then the rest of them have proximal, middle, and distal phalangeal bones. So we have one that's closer, proximal, that's what proximal means, closer to the trunk of the body, the one in the middle, and then the one furthest away, distal. So of the metacarpals and of the phalangeal bones, there are only 2 landmarks we'll pay attention to, which is the base and the head. The base of all of these bones is always on the more proximal side of the bone, and the head is on the distal end of that bone. So in this particular case, if we were looking at this individual metacarpal, the base is going to be right here on this side. So this is the base, and over here would be the head. And that would be consistent for all of our metacarpals and also phalangeal bones. So let's take a look at, finally, the carpal bones. So you may want to go ahead and take the time to try to memorize and remember which bones are in which group and what order they come in. So one, what 4 bones are in the proximal group, what 4 bones are in the distal group, and what is the order of those bones from lateral to medial or medial to lateral, whichever. So personally, I have a little story, I like a child's story, that I kind of developed after, a very similar example that my instructor had given me. So imagine that in a far off land, in a very, very distant past, there was a king who wanted to prove his power and build a monument all the way to the moon. So if you're going to build a monument, you're going to build a bunch of scaffolding, right? Scaffolding is those little tiered shelves that workers will stand upon while they're working on a structure. So scaphoid is the first and most lateral bone of the proximal row of carpals. So the scaffolding is building a monument all the way to the moon, which we draw a little crescent moon. So moon, lunar, lunate. The lunate is the next bone right next to the scaphoid. So once he reached the moon, he wasn't satisfied with, demonstrating his powers. So he decided to build ships in which he could venture off into the dark beyond of space. So he built 3 rocket ships, which the best way I can try to associate this word, triquetrum. Triquetrum is the 3rd bone and almost the most medial bone of the proximal row of these carpals. So then this king launches his rockets into space and reaches the constellation of Pisces, which is our last bone, the most medial bone of the proximal row of carpals, called pisiform. So Pisces. All right, so our little story is unfolding here. So in celebration of this king's great feats, he held a grand carnival, and in that carnival was the man on the flying trapeze. So trapezium is our first bone on the lateral side of the distal carpal bones. So this number 5 right here. So the carnival was housed in a trapezoidal structure. So we have the trapezoid, however I could associate to the best. Now, unfortunately, this man on the flying trapeze did not put on an adequate show for the king, and he was sentenced to death by the old French style decapitation by guillotine. I know it's a little morbid, so hide the kids. But capitiate is our next bone. So before this man was to be executed, he was given the nicety of a final meal, which happened to be a ham sandwich, and he ate it. And so we have hamate being our last bone. So to restate it, all of our bones. So in our proximal row on the most lateral side, starting from the most lateral side, we have the scaphoid, the lunate, the triquetrum, and the pisiform. In our distal row, starting from the lateral side, we have the trapezium, the trapezoid, the capitiate, and the hamate. And those are our carpal bones. And so I'll go ahead and post back up to the slides here so we can actually take a look at just a couple extra pictures. So right here we have the lower ends of what we were talking about. So this you're looking at the posterior side. In this particular case, we have these fossas, which I did forget to mention. The olecranon fossa is on the posterior side of the humerus, and the olecranon fossa is where the olecranon process is actually going to terminate at. And then we have the coronoid fossa, which is where the coronoid process of the ulna is going to articulate with as well. So then we have our radius and ulna. So in this case, we're looking at, again, the right one. So here's our medial side. This is the ulna, right? We have the olecranon process, trochlear notch, coronoid process, excuse me. We have the head of the radius, right? Radial tuberosity, is another landmark, but I don't think it's too crazy to pay that much attention to. And then the styloid processes on both. Sorry, I forgot to mention that the styloid process also does exist on the distal end of the ulna as well. And then here's our carpal bones. So if you wanted to take a moment to write these out with the actual spellings here. So remember, starting here, this is our most lateral side. Here's our most medial side. So here's our scaphoid, right? The lunate, triquetrum, and then the pisiform. Up into the, and then we can draw this out, right? So here's so this is our proximal row, distal row. So proximal row from lateral to medial, distal row from lateral to medial, trapezium, trapezoid, capitiate, and then the hamate. And then here is our metacarpals and phalangeal bones. As we said, very simple. As you can see here, it just splits off, sections off the bones, right? So our metacarpals are in the palm of the hand, and then the phalangeal bones are in our fingers, and all but the thumb have a proximal, middle, and a distal, while the thumb only has a proximal and a distal. So now we can take a look at our joints. So our first joint is the humeral radial joint, which happens to be the articulation where the humerus articulates with the radius. Now, as we saw in our little picture, this occurred between the head of the humerus, or excuse me, head of the radius with the capitulum of the humerus. So this is actually a bit of a interesting joint because, and I'll show you with an actual forearm here what exactly we're looking at. But as you see here, it's a gliding plane joint, but it has like a pseudo ball and socket type relationship. And it can perform the movements of flexion, extension, and pivotal movements that we'll see, such as rotation, that is going to help with creating pronation and supination of the forearm, as we're going to see here. So one important thing to notice is that we do have the annular ligament. So it's not very common that I will list out ligaments and stuff like that, but some are, I think, rather important to know. So the annular ligament is actually a circular, because annular meaning circular, right? If something is annular, it happens once a year, which is one complete circular cycle. This is a circular ring of cartilage around the head of the radius. And then we have the radial collateral ligament. Collateral ligaments are the ligaments that run vertical alongside two bones. And we're gonna see a lot of collateral ligaments also in the knee. It's almost the same structure. So in this particular case, we have the radial collateral ligament, which is this ligament right here on the lateral side. So let's just go ahead and go over all our joints, and then we'll do a physical demonstration of the movements themselves and give you guys a good little three-dimensional view. So almost looking at the same picture here, we have the humero-ulnar joint because, well, at the same rate, our humerus and our ulnar do meet. And as we saw, the trochlear notch of the ulna rides in the trochlea, almost like it's like train tracks, and just glides through. Now, interesting to note, as we can see here, that when we fully bring our joint into one direction, and in this case flexion, the coronoid process will sit in that coronoid fossa that we saw as our landmarks. And then when we do the opposite movement in the opposite direction for extension, the coronoid, or excuse me, the olecranon process sits in the olecranon fossa of the joint itself, of the humerus. So as we can see with this joint, it's labeled as a hinge joint, which if you've watched the video on kinesiology where I go over and explain the different types of joints, hinge joints only allow for flexion and extension. And very similar to the humeral-ulnar or humeral-radial joint, where we had that radial collateral ligament, we have the ulnar collateral ligament. So in this case, it runs just like this between the humerus and the ulna. So at our wrist, we have the radiocarpal joint, which is the technical joint of our wrist, which is formed by the distal end of the radius or the carpal end of the radius with the scaphoid and the lunate bone. As you can see here, right, the fact that it's such a big couple bones there, that articulation there exists. And so as we can see, this is a condylar type joint that allows for flexion, extension, and radial deviation. I don't know why I didn't list it, but also ulnar deviation as well, which are actually forms of adduction and abduction. Again, we're going to demonstrate all these movements here in a second. So then we're looking at the proximal and distal radio-ulnar joint. So this is obviously between the radius and the ulna, and one being proximal, one being distal. So we can see that the radius and the ulna meet in two various places. And the movements we find here are pronation and supination. So we also know these particular joints are just understanding the name is the most important thing. We have the carpal metacarpal joint and we have the midcarpal joint. So the midcarpal joint is just the existence of a joint in between the proximal versus the distal row. And there's joints in between each of the carpal bones, of course. But, we're not going to go into all that. That's just a little too much. But the carpal metacarpal joint is where the carpal bones meet the metacarpals. And outside of one of these joints, there's only one important one, which is the first carpo-metacarpal joint, which with a lot of these, I know that's a very big mouthful of a name to say. We acronym it the CMCJ, carpo-metacarpal joint. So in this particular case, the first carpo-metacarpal joint is our thumb joint, which again we'll demonstrate here in a sec, which is formed by the base of the first metacarpal with the trapezium of the carpal bones, of the distal row of carpal bones. And so our saddle, so this is a saddle joint, and this allows us to perform flexion, extension, adduction, abduction, and opposition as well as reopposition. So then we have the metacarpal phalangeal joints, which are the big knuckles of our hands. So this is where the metacarpals meet the phalangeal joints, which have lots of movement, as we'll see, where we can do flexion, extension, adduction, and abduction, which also will include circumduction. And then lastly, we have the interphalangeal joints, which are the joints in between the two phalangeal bones. So in this case, of the fingers, of the digits 2 through 5, which includes from the index finger to the pinky finger, we have the proximal and distal interphalangeal joints, while on the thumb, we just have the interphalangeal joint of digit 1. So in this case, they are the flexion and extensions of this joint here. So let's go ahead and do a physical demonstration of these movements and of these joints here. So first off, our elbow. Now our elbow complex, I like to call it the elbow complex because as we saw, we had the humeral ulnar joint and the humeral radial joint. And I know that the humeral ulnar joint is what's most commonly labeled as the elbow joint, but the humeral radial joint has to go along with the movement. So I call it the complex, the elbow complex, because we do have two movements, two joints having to move at the elbow to create the flexion and extension. And remember that flexion and extension is just that bending movement. So flexion is to bend where the two bones are going to come together and the angle between those two bones decreases, and then extension being the opposite. So this is what it looks like, as we can see. So here's your olecranon process, right? Here's the trochlear notch. Here's the trochlea of the humerus, and you can see how it just tracks right along in there, nice and easy like. Now we have right here the humeral radial joint, and we saw that, of course it did the flexion and extension, but then it does this pivot movement. As you can see, it turns on the spot, almost like I'm trying to create a fire, a very primitive fire. So between this pivot here, and then we have the proximal and distal radial ulnar joints, we're creating pronation and supination. So of the hand, my hand right now is supinated. This is pronation. This is supination. And it's actually kind of cool when you really look at it. So with our hand in neutral position, to create pronation, we have to cross the radius over the ulna. So it's almost like you're making an X with the bones of your forearm to create pronation. Pronation is the X movement, I like to call it. And so it's kind of important to note that the wrist itself does not do pronation and supination. I know we measure pronation and supination by the position of the hand and the wrist, but if I were to hold my radius and ulna down, I cannot turn my hand over without that occurring here in the forearm. So then we have the wrist, the radiocarpal joint, which can perform flexion, extension, and then we have radial deviation, ulnar deviation. So when we talk about the deviation, we're referring that the hand is deviating towards the bone we're talking about. So radial deviation means that my hand is pointing towards the radial side, so towards the radial bone here, and that's ulnar deviation, sorry. So ulnar deviation in this case, right, I'm pointing to the ulnar side, and then radial deviation being the opposite. Now, it might be also kind of important to note that I can have more ulnar deviation than I can have radial deviation, as you can see, specifically because if you look at it, right, that styloid process of the radius kind of like stops that movement from occurring, while as opposed to there not being as much structure on the ulnar side, I can have more ulnar deviation. And remember that this is, like we said, this is adduction because my wrist is now pointing towards the midline, and then abduction because my hand is moving away from the midline. So ulnar and radial deviation are forms of adduction and abduction. Then we had the, of course we had the wrist joints, all the bones in the wrist, right? But looking at the thumb, specifically, the first carpal metacarpal joint of the thumb, the saddle joint, right, we had flexion, extension, adduction, abduction, and then we have opposition, which means the ability to cross over the hand and touch the pads of the fingers. So we have opposition, reopposition to go back in the opposite direction. Of the metacarpal phalangeal joints, we have flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, which can then produce circumduction. And then our interphalangeal joints, just a little flexion, extension. Here is a little depiction of those movements occurring if you wanted to take a little snapshot of those. So moving on into our muscles, our first muscle is the brachialis muscle. Now, biceps brachii would be an important muscle of this lecture because it does flex the elbow, as well as it does supinate the hand, but we already learned that in the shoulder and arm lecture. But brachialis actually sits right underneath your biceps brachii and almost acts as a sidekick. Well, not almost. It does act as a sidekick to the biceps brachii in flexing the elbow here. So in this case, we can see if we zoom in, right, we're looking at the anterior side. This is coracobrachialis right here. So we're attaching to the anterior surface of the humerus about midway down, and then we're attaching to the ulna. And so in this case, when we follow the direction of the muscle fibers and we pull these parts of the bones together, that means that the ulna is going to be pulled towards the humerus on the front side. So in this case, we're going to follow this direction. So we're going to bring here, shoot, all the way to here. So the insertion in this case to origin, which if you track my lectures on kinesiology, you would know that I don't really get too hyped up about origin versus insertion. I think it's more important to just understand that muscles only pull the parts of the bones they're touching together in line with the direction of the fibers. So in this case, I would just pull the ulna towards the humerus on the front side to produce flexion. So the brachioradialis muscle, one of my very favorite muscles of the body. So this actually comes from the lateral, so as we see here, the lateral supracondylar ridge, which we can just safely say lateral condyle, so we don't have to say this whole mouthful of information here, and then reaches down to the styloid process of the radius. So this one is a very interesting muscle because you're going to need like a three-dimensional image to fully grasp the dynamics of its movement. We call this muscle the handshake muscle, specifically because right here, this action brings the wrist to mid position. And I'll go into a physical demonstration here in a second to demonstrate what we're talking about, but it also acts as an elbow flexor. So let's go ahead and do the physical demonstration. So my brachioradialis muscle is this muscle right here. And so it comes from this lateral side of my forearm and then wraps to the styloid process here. So because of this angle, if this muscle stays contracted, it's the angle that it has, the line it has, is just going to bring my hand here into mid position, handshake position, because I'm trying to shake your hand. So more technically, what we would say is that the brachioradialis muscle actually performs pronation and supination when those movements are opposed. So if my hand is in the supinated position, my brachioradialis is actually going to form pronation, but only to mid position, and then vice versa. If my hand's in the pronated position, it's going to perform supination, but again, only to the mid position. So it just brings the arm to mid position, but as well as flexes the forearm. So that's actually a little better demonstration of the brachioradialis muscle right there. Like I said, one of my favorite muscles in these lectures. Now, we're going to get into the flexors and extensors of the forearm. And to make it really easy for you guys, I've created some generic rules about these muscles that if you can apply these rules, you're going to be fine. And that when you look at these muscles, all you're going to need is the name of the muscle to tell you everything you need to know about the muscle. So first rule is flexor muscles are on the anterior side of the forearm and extensors on the posterior side of the forearm. We'll do a physical demonstration in a second. The flexor muscles, and this is a really important one right here, flexors come from the medial side. So when I say medial condyle, we're going to find that some of the forearm muscles, flexor muscles, come from the medial epicondyle, medial supracondylar ridge. Most commonly, it's the medial epicondyle that you'll see, or there's epicondyle in general, both medial and lateral side, but whatever, just medial side. Flexors come from the medial side. So that means that our extensors come from the lateral side, the lateral condyle. This one right here is, this is just the star, right? The rest of the name will hint to its insertion, right? So when we actually look at these names, it'll make more sense. Now, if it has flexor in the name, which we're going to have quite a few flexor muscles, it's going to obviously flex. Why would I call it a flexor muscle if it didn't perform flexion? And then vice versa. If it's extensor, then it will extend. Specifically, we're going to be looking at mostly, either the wrist or sometimes the digits. If it has carpi in the name, obviously it acts on the wrist, right? Because carpal means wrist. So flexor carpi means that it's going to flex the wrist. Extensor carpi is going to extend the wrist. If it has, now this one, another big important one right here. This one is what's going to help you not be confused a lot of times. If it has radialis in the name, it performs radial deviation. If it has ulnaris in the name, it performs ulnar deviation, which is a major piece because whether it's a flexor or an extensor, if it has radialis in the name, it's performing radial deviation. And another, which goes alongside with this third hint here. If it has radialis in the name, then it's attaching on the hand side closer to the, on the radial bone. So it'll probably be digits 2 or 3. And then if it has ulnaris, then it's probably going to be attaching to digits 4 or 5. Metacarpals, that is. And then digitorum specifically means that it acts on the fingers. Now, specifically fingers 2 through 5. Why? Because this is a major rule that the thumb moves completely independent and has its own muscles. And all of those muscles have the word pollicis in the name. And the word pollicis refers to the thumb. As I like to think about it, pollicis means politics, and you can vote yes or no with your thumb. All right, so those are our general rules of the flexor and extensors. These very few basic rules are going to help you understand this big long list of overly complicated named muscles. But the name themselves are going to tell you everything you need to know. Look at all these muscles. It's a lot, right? It's tremendous. We don't need to take too much time to remember all these. So here are our extensor muscles. Here's our extensor muscle group. We have extensor carpi radialis longus, extensor carpi radialis brevis, extensor carpi ulnaris, extensor digitorum. So remember from our rules that, well, one, all of these have extensor. So one, they're going to extend the structures we're talking about, and they're all coming from, oh, look at that, the lateral side of our humerus. So like I said, epicondyle being the most common, but like I said, you can just simplistically say condyle. So all of these come from the lateral side. All right, so we see here that these have radialis in the name, which means that, one, they're going to perform, well, radial deviation, which is known as abduction of the wrist. So we have abduction of the wrist. And we said they would insert around the radial side of the hand. So the radial side of the hand includes the second and third metacarpals, right? Boom, second and third metacarpals. They have extensor in the name, carpi in the name, so that means they extend the wrist. Now, they also do serve as minor assistance to flexion of specifically the elbow, which should be connotated there, but which mostly they act as synergists and stabilizers to help with that movement, but whatever. So again, we have extensor carpi ulnaris, so again, wrist and ulnar. So we're going to extend the wrist and adduct the wrist, aka ulnar deviation. Then we have extensor digitorum, which, as we saw, digitorum means that it acts on the fingers. So in this particular case, extensor digitorum goes all the way to the very distal phalangeal bone of the digits 2 through 5. So of all the fingers other than the thumb, and then so that means it's going to extend all the structures in that line. It's going to extend all the interphalangeal joints, the metacarpal phalangeal joint, and the wrist as well. So we'll go ahead and do just a quick little demonstration of all that. So one, like we said, my extensor muscles are coming from the lateral side of my forearm here and moving out this way. So that means that extensor carpi radialis, longus, and brevis. Longus just means longer. Brevis means a little bit shorter. So they're coming from here and running all the way to the metacarpal joint, metacarpal bone 2 and 3. And they're going to, well, so you can see based off of this line, when they pull, they're going to do radial deviation and extension of my wrist like that. And then extensor carpi ulnaris, right? It's going to go to the ulnar side of the hand. So either 2 or either 4 or 5 of my metacarpals, and then ulnar deviation, extension. Extensor digitorum, as you can see, the striated little appearance here is going to extend all of these joints here, right? So extend all of the interphalangeal joints, the metacarpal phalangeal joint, the wrist, the radiocarpal joint, right? All of that will be an extension. And again, why take the time to write out all of these pieces of information, right? And like, oh, lateral condyle, when you could just remember some general rules, and literally just the name of the muscle itself is giving you everything you need to know. At least know well enough that you can get it right on your test. So let's apply those rules to the flexor muscles. So we have flexor carpi radialis, flexor carpi ulnaris, flexor digitorum superficialis, flexor digitorum profundus, and palmaris longus. So we have a lot more flexor muscles, and we do have a couple interesting concepts about the flexor digitorum muscles here that we'll take a look at. But flexor carpi radialis, okay, well, it's flexor, flexes the wrist, radialis, radial deviation. All right, and so remember, all of these come from the medial side of the forearm, with one exception, flexor digitorum profundus. We're actually going to take a look at that there. But as we saw, flexor carpi radialis, right, on the radial side of the hand, metacarpals 2 and 3, right? Flex and abduct. Remember, abduction is radial deviation of the wrist. Flexor carpi ulnaris. Who cares about the hook of hamate? Whatever. It's on the radial ulnar side of the hand. 5th metacarpal. Again, flex the wrist, adduct the wrist, aka ulnar deviation. Now let's take a look at the relation between flexor digitorum superficialis and profundus. So one, deeper muscles of the body are a little bit shorter than the superficial muscles. So in this particular case, right, flexor digitorum doesn't actually touch the elbow or across the elbow. It's actually in or situated on our forearm. So it's just like sits on the, as it says here, proximal anterior portion of the ulna, and it's just like it just sits in the and deep into the forearm. As we can see, profundus. Like if you're a profound thinker, you think deeply. So now the thing is, flexor digitorum superficialis goes all the way to the middle phalangeal bones, where profundus actually goes a little bit further to the distal phalangeal bones. And it's actually pretty interesting. If we maybe I can get a good picture. No, not on this picture. Yeah, that'll work. So as we can see here, this is flexor digitorum superficialis. It actually splits. It splits off and then attaches to the middle phalangeal bone. And then profundus actually rides through that split like it's a tunnel and goes to the distal. So it's to me a pretty interesting setup, because normally deeper muscles of the body don't travel further past the more superficial muscles. So this is one of the few exceptions, and it's kind of interesting. But nothing too much to really park your face at. But either way, they're all going to be flexing the wrist, right? Flexing the fingers, all that good stuff. I guess as it says here, flexor digitorum superficialis helps to ulnar deviate, but whatever. And then palmaris longus is actually, I think we had a picture. Nope. Maybe back here. I guess. Yeah, right there. So the palmar fascia, it's not even the palmar fascia, but it's just a connective tissue on the palm of the hand, and there's a big, so right here, the tendon right there, tendon of palmaris longus, right? So palmaris longus just has one big tendon that comes down to the palm of the hand, and it flexes the wrist and tightens the palmar fascia, as we'll see. And so let's go ahead and do just a quick little physical demonstration. So remember, from the medial side, all of our flexor muscles are coming. And so our radialis is going to be over here, radial deviation, flexion. Ulnaris, on the ulnar side, ulnar deviation, flexion. Digitorum profundus and superficialis, flexion of the different fingers, right? So as you can see, the difference between why does the flexor side have two digitorum flexors versus the extensor? Because we need to be, so on the flexor side, we can articulate the fingers a little better. Whereas extending, I can just bring all the fingers back, and then I can use the intricacies of the flexors to independently flex fingers as I need, right? So in this case, I can independently flex just the proximal interphalangeal joint, and then so that's superficialis. Then I can add in digitorum profundus and do both, right? So that way we can orchestrate the finite, intricate movements of our hand. Really interesting. Hands and forearms, very, very delicate work here, very intricate work, lots of muscles, but that's why we're trying to keep it super simple for you guys with just those general rules, in my opinion. And then palmaris longus. A fun fact about palmaris longus is that some people don't actually have a palmaris longus. So kind of interesting. So let's go back to our slides and honestly wrap it up, because that's the bulk of the lecture. Was that just knocked out like 10 different muscles in 2 slides in like 10-15 minutes, not even. So some accessory muscles is what we have is called Anconeus. Anconeus is this, it almost looks like a little milkshake or ice cream cone, right? Anconeus looks like a little cone. It is an elbow extender. Kind of helps a little bit, right, deep into the back of the forearm there, little Anconeus. And then moving on, we have the some assisting muscles in pronation and supination. So we have pronator teres and pronator quadratus. Well, as we can see, pronators in the name, both of those muscles are involved with pronation. And in order to do pronation, as we saw with the demonstration on the little skeletal bones we had to pull the radius over the ulna. So in this case, right, if we look at these muscles here, so pronator teres, first thing to notice is that pronator teres is the more proximal muscle. And so it attaches onto the medial side, or medial condyle, right? And then attaches to the radius, and then it pulls the radius over in this direction. Pronator quadratus is actually by the wrist, and again, it's going to be attached to the ulna and pull the radius over. Almost like, to me, it looks like someone trying to pull a blanket over them and take a nap or something, right? So those are our pronator muscles, and then supinator, well, is going to perform supination. As we see, it's on the back of the forearm here, attaching on the various bones, right, the lateral condyle and part of the ulna itself, and then attaching to the radius to then pull the radius back over for supination. So, and we're going to pull this way for supination. And so, like I said, you should be able to, once we've actually, since we've gone through the bones and the landmarks and what they look like, you should be able to just identify these landmarks and just, again, use your knowledge of the movements of the joints and what they look like to understand what movements are going to be produced by this muscle just by solely looking at a picture of them. And then a big long list of muscles that are going to move the thumb. Well, like I said, all of the muscles that move the thumb are going to have pollicis in the name, right? We see that pollicis is the running theme. And then the other part of the name is just going to tell it what it's going to do. Abductor pollicis. It abducts the thumb. So we have an abductor longus and brevis, whatever. We have extensor pollicis longus and brevis. Flexor pollicis longus and brevis. Opponent's pollicis. Adductor pollicis. You know, so it's all the same, right? We already know what the movements of the thumb is, and I to be honest, who cares about any of this else? All you need to know is that basic little column right there, just based off of the name, what it's basically doing. Like all the extra tiny little finite stuff, like who, is it really that big of a deal? Now, you could, of course, take the time to learn it all, but why? At least for being a massage therapist, right? We don't need to learn all that super intricate detail. So here's some additional muscles, so all of the muscles, as you can see from the thumb, right? All these little things here. Lumbricals, I think are, yeah, okay, they're on the next slide. So the lumbricals are kind of interesting. They're the muscles deeper into the palm of the hand, and they just help to extend and flex the interphalangeal joints independently. Notice though, there's no muscles in the fingers, right? Our fingers are nothing but tendons and ligaments and all that good stuff. So all of our massage and body work is actually like here in the hand. And as you can see, maybe the lumbricals with some of the the proximal attachment sites of the hand or fingers themselves. But outside of that, there's nothing out here. So some other interesting things that we can label about the hand and forearm here is, well, one structure called the anatomical snuff box, as we see here, the little outline, is formed by extensors, the tendons of extensor pollicis longus and brevis. So in this case, this is extensor pollicis longus, this is extensor pollicis brevis, right? Anatomical snuff box, right? Snuff, if you're not familiar, is just something old-timey, back in the day thing. People would either snort or you could dip it, stuff like that. And so, well, no need to explain what's going on there. Some common words here, common referenced terms we could say is we have the thenar eminence and the hypothenar eminence. The thenar eminence refers to the thumb side of the palm of the hands, and the hypothenar refers to the pinky side of the palm of the hand. We also have here the interosseous membrane, which is, well, inter meaning in between, os, bone, osseous, right, membrane. So this is the membrane of connective tissue in between two bones. In this particular case, the radius and the ulna. And as we can see here, it serves as attachment sites for muscles of the forearm, one of which we saw was flexor digitorum super profundus as one of them. It attaches like right here and then reaches out. Then we have the retinaculums. So a retinaculum or retinacula is a band of connective tissue that holds tendons down. So in this case, the extensor retinaculum holds down the extensor tendons. As we can see, this is on the back of the wrist. And then flexor retinaculum holds down the tendons on the flexor side of the wrist. Other key terminology, volar surface of the hand is the palmar surface of the hand. Dorsal refers to the back or the posterior aspect of anything, but specifically in this case, the hand. Indicus refers to the index finger. Pollicis, as we said, refers to the thumb. Digiti minimi is the pinky side. Cubital is the is actually not the front. It's It's just the back of the elbow. And then the antecubital is the front. So the little dip of on the front of your elbow is the antecubital. The olecranon process side, the big bony side on the back, is the cubital. And then, well, where would we be without knowing that the forearm is called the antebrachial? So anti, as you see, antecubital, antebrachial. Ante is a word meaning to come before. So that means that this part comes before the arm. So the forearm, get it? Before the arm, forearm, antecubital, antebrachial. And then that would be our pathologies. So that is the entire lecture on the forearm and hands. So just a quick little recap here. Remember that all of your bones, hopefully you can draw this little picture. We have the radius and the ulna. Specifically, you want to make sure you know and always memorize which bone is on which side. The ulna is on the medial side, radius on the lateral. If you want to remember the little story we made for the carpal bones, by all means go back to that part of the video and get that little story there. But remembering which bones are in the proximal and distal row might be beneficial. You never know. So then into the forearm and hand muscles, joints. We have the elbow complex, right? The radial ulnar, humeral ulnar, humeral radial, right? That's your elbow complex, flexion and extension. The humeral radial can do a little pivot joint with the proximal radial and distal radial ulnar joints, doing pronation and supination. Our wrist doing flexion extension, adduction, abduction, aka ulnar deviation, radial deviation. Our thumb doing flexion extension, abduction, adduction, opposition, reopposition. And then our metacarpal phalangeal joints doing flexion extension, abduction, adduction, and then circumduction. Our interphalangeal joints doing flexion, extension. And then we go into all those muscles, right? Brachioradialis, our handshake muscle, brings it to mid position, handshake. Brachialis flexes. Then we had all of the flexor and extensor forearms, remembering that flexors come from the medial side of the humerus, medial condyle, extensors from the lateral. Extensors are on the back, flexors are on the front. And then the name is going to tell you everything. If so, it has carpi in the name, it flexes the wrist. Has digitorum in the name, it's going to work on the digits, right? Extensor is going to extend, flexor is going to flex. One of the bigger things is radialis in the name, radial deviation. Ulnaris in the name, ulnar deviation. The thumb has all those muscles to do the specific joints that we just labeled. And that's the lecture right there. If you can just remember those simple little facts, you should be good for this lecture. So I'm gonna cut that video off and see you guys on the next one.